welcome to everyone who is joining us on Zoom this morning and on Facebook Live. So very welcome from me as well. Yeah, you probably know me by now. I'm Nina Held. I'm one of the Sochika researchers. I've worked for Sochika for the last 4 years. The project is unfortunately coming to an end very soon. And I'm very hugely excited to be chairing the first keynote session of our conference. And I will shortly introduce you to Katrin Hugendubel, but first some housekeeping things. It is, of course, very unfortunate that we have to do this event online and that we can't be physically together. And we had actually planned to bring all our participants together in Brighton. And it would have been so lovely to see you all live and meet you from the 3 different countries, all of our participants, and obviously everyone who is joining the conference. On the other hand, doing a conference online also has some advantages. So we've had registrations from all over the world. We have about 600 people registered. But because it's a large number, we're doing this as webinars mainly. So we're very sorry that there won't be as much interaction, maybe a bit more in the workshops and in the panels. We can be a bit more interactive. But for the keynotes, we ask you, please, if you have questions for Katrin, please put them in the question and answer box on the bottom that you see in the bottom of your screen. And then we will be sharing these questions with Katrin after her keynote. And also already to say, this is the first time we are organizing an online conference as Sochika. So maybe not everything will go according to plan. And we hope that we can address all or most of the questions, but please bear with us if something doesn't work as it should be working. So I'm hugely excited to introduce you to Katrin Hugendubel, who is the Advocacy Director of ILGA Europe. In this role, she's in charge of the overall coordination of the policy and advocacy work. Her main tasks include managing the policy team, and as well as leading the advocacy work towards the EU institutions, EU presidencies, the Council of Europe, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the UN. And of course, some of this policy work is also relating to Sochi asylum claims, and Katrin is going to tell us a little bit about the work they're doing in that respect. She holds a master's degree in political science and English language and literature from the University of Freiburg. And before joining ILGA, she also worked as a political advisor and assistant to a member of the European Parliament, as well as with several NGO networks on EU level and in Uganda. And the main focus of her studies and work life has been anti-discrimination policies and feminist politics, as well as European social and labor market policies. So welcome, Katrin. We are very excited to have you here. I'm going to switch off my camera again, if I can just wait a moment and let you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nina, and thanks for everyone to joining this. It's very exciting, even if very new for everyone, I think, to do this online. And I want to start by letting an Azeri LGBT asylum seeker living undocumented in Germany and their pieces of art speak, actually, before speaking myself. This was published in December 2019, anonymously and under the title, "I Am Illegal." So these are their words. Also the piece you'll be seeing are pieces of the work they've been doing. An estimated 8,000 Azerbaijani citizens fled the country in 2018. They leave for different reasons, but many face the same fate abroad. Their applications are denied and they are forced to make a difficult decision, living in limbo, waiting for a review, flee elsewhere, or face returning home. For many, the prospect of going back to Azerbaijan is more than just a disappointment. For political activists, it can mean jail or detention, And it's even worse for the LGBTIQ community. Azerbaijan was named the most dangerous country in Europe for the LGBTIQ community in 2019. The ranking reflects a coordinated effort by the government to make life difficult for LGBTI and non-binary people in the country. In 2017, for example, there was an organized crackdown against the LGBTI plus community. Reportedly, dozens of people were arrested and at least one was allegedly beaten in custody. Now this should, I'm sorry. See, that's the beauty of it all. Now it doesn't change. Just bear with me for 1 second. I am sorry about this. Oops. Voila. Today, members of the LGBTI community have no safeguards against discrimination or wrongful treatment. They can be harassed, kicked out of their homes and arbitrarily dismissed from their jobs. They cannot marry, cannot adopt, and can legally be subjected to conversion therapy. The LGBTI community has been robbed of the chance for a normal life at home, and so they give up everything for the chance to live with fear far from home. This is the story of one Azerbaijani citizen who, like so many before them, sought asylum and refuge in Europe. They are buoyed by the idea that European values could secure a better future than their native country offered them. But 4 years later, they've become a number in a system, a statistic in a database, a faceless illegal in a queue. And I find this last image especially powerful, I have to say, and I think I'll just leave it there maybe as a background for what I'm going to say. So it's a real honor to have been invited to speak at this conference, and thanks a lot to Nina for introducing me earlier. As the advocacy director of ILGA Europe, I coordinate, as Nina said, ILGA Europe's advocacy work, of which asylum is a very important part. We work on standard setting and legislation on European level, and with our members, supporting them in improving laws and practices at national level. We work on improving implementation of legislation and advancing strategic litigation that also in the area of asylum has been so crucial, and it was referred to in the little video before by Moira already. Many of our member organizations are also often the first go-to point for refugees, providing legal advice, sometimes offering safe accommodations, shelters, as well as supporting community building and self-led advocacy. The perspective I'm speaking from is of someone working for and with an LGBTI network of over 600 LGBTI organizations and initiatives from 54 countries across Europe and Central Asia. Working on asylum is one key element of protecting the human rights of LGBTI people. The lack of protection and the existence of laws and actions violating the rights of LGBTI people, hate and discrimination persisting in society, have long driven LGBTI people from their homes to places presumably safer. Europe and primarily the EU have a reputation as a place where LGBTI people can live, love and be themselves freely and openly, and is thus one choice of destination. As other asylum seekers and refugees, LGBTI asylum seekers are fleeing conflicts, persecution or instabilities in their home countries. Others come to escape the specific dangers of being LGBTI in their home countries. The number of people seeking asylum in the EU on the grounds of sexual orientation, gender identity and expression and sex characteristics is not small, and neither are the challenges they face. Policies have put protecting borders over protecting lives in recent years, and the right to safety have in the last years made the struggle of everyone arriving in the EU and seeking asylum harder and harder. In their daily lives, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and intersex asylum seekers and refugees face multiple forms of discrimination, intersections of racism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, sexism. They're often exposed to additional risks throughout their journey, making them particularly vulnerable to physical, sexual, and psychological violence, but both before and after arriving in the country where they file for asylum. The difficulties experienced by LGBTI asylum seekers and refugees are exacerbated by a lack of awareness about their specific needs, among staff in reception and detention centers, interview officers, case officers, interpreters, amongst others. And the lack of awareness results in lack of appropriate services and solutions, since needs that are unknown are needs that cannot be addressed. All but 3 EU member states, and those unfortunate exceptions are Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, and Estonia, currently have laws or policies in place recognizing sexual orientation. So that's 24 countries in the EU. 18 have laws including the ground of gender identity, and 3, Belgium, Sweden, and Spain, include sex characteristics in the list of protected grounds in legislation. So there are still clear legislative gaps to be filled. And where legislation exists, implementation of the law remains flawed. But before I come back to the EU and the failed dream of a safe haven for LGBTI refugees and talk about the upcoming reform of the common European asylum system, as I've been asked to do, let me first go back to the notion of Europe and the EU as a safe place. As I said, ILGA Europe is a network of organizations across Europe and Central Asia. We have over the last few years clearly observed how the notions of safety and the need for resettlement and asylum have been shifting and how they have been increasing. Whereas of course there are legislative advances in the protection of human rights for LGBTI people across the region still happening, the climate of hate and discrimination has been on the rise. We see more and more targeted attacks on LGBTI rights and LGBTI people by hostile governments, but also by ultra-conservative groups, well-resourced and globally interlinked. Whereas for a few years we identified stagnation, we're now seeing backlash. The prosecution and discrimination of LGBTI people is getting harsher across the region and hitting the most vulnerable in the community hardest. Most articles referring to LGBTI people fleeing their countries refer to the number of countries where same-sex relations are still criminalized. And that's, of course, a very important reason for LGBT people to flee their countries. But we need to also take a closer look to the situation of trans and intersex people, to the situation of LGBTI people of faith, BIPOC, LGBTI people, sex workers, and many others in assessing the situation more closely. I want to draw a quick picture of what I mean with the increasing hostile and unsafe situation across Europe. The most striking examples are the purge on LGBTI people in Chechnya in 2017 and 19, and the persecution of LGBTI people in 2017 and 19 in Azerbaijan, targeting mainly sex workers. We see a rise in homophobic and transphobic violence across Europe, clearly documented, for example, by research in the UK and in Finland. Trans rights are being attacked, putting people at risk when following their day-to-day life. In the UK, the debate on trans rights has become very violent. Events now need to be secured by professional security forces. We see the Polish LGBTI community being pulled into the middle of political confrontations, stoking hatred and inciting violence. Over 100 communities and cities in Poland have declared themselves LGBTI-free zones, and the president and presidential candidates do this at the moment, issuing LGBTI-phobic campaign statements nearly on a daily basis. In Hungary, legal gender recognition was banned by law only in May. In Turkey, LGBTI activists are standing trial for organizing a pride and being charged with supporting terrorist activities, while the president is endorsing homophobia from religious leaders. And the COVID-19 pandemic has further exacerbated this situation in some countries. I do not want to say that this situation is immediately comparable with someone fleeing criminalization of their sexual orientation. But what we clearly have been seeing over the last years is that a lot more LGBTI people are crossing borders to seek safety, also within the region. Movement, not necessarily on the traditional refugee routes, and very often also not necessarily to countries we would consider champions when it comes to the protection of LGBTI people and their fundamental rights. And the work of our members clearly reflects these new routes. So in Russia, one of our members is supporting LGBTI asylum seekers from Central Asia, as well as from some regions within Russia, such as Chechnya, often not being able to provide safety, but supporting people as a first contact point. In Georgia, an organization is supporting LGBTI women from Russia and Azerbaijan. In Armenia, refugees from Cuba and Syria find state social workers asking LGBTI organizations to help with accommodation requests, as they themselves have little to none experience with LGBTI people and their needs. LGBTI activists in Kyrgyzstan support cases from Uzbekistan, including coordinating a shelter. In Kazakhstan, members also support cases from Uzbekistan, but are also receiving cases from Kyrgyzstan, as well as supporting cases out of their own country. In 2019, 17 people, LGBTI people from Albania, were seeking asylum elsewhere. Azeri people continue to seek safety in Turkey as the one country in the region where they do not need a visa, with the situation in Turkey being anything but safe and very worrying for LGBTI people and activists. And how are we going to deal with people starting to seek asylum from one EU member state to another? I know it sounds very far-fetched. Fleeing violence and state discrimination in Poland, fleeing a denial of their existence by banning LGR in Hungary. Freedom of movement will not cover the needs of many of the most marginalized, even within the EU, to look for safety from violence and denial of their existence. So why have I been listing all this? Because often when we talk about asylum systems, we have very traditional roots and cases in mind. But the reality is getting increasingly complex, and we are looking at an interconnected net of roots and increasing needs. This complex reality makes our calls for adequate and detailed country of origin information, including detailed and continuously updated information about the situation for gays, lesbian, bisexuals, transgender, intersex, and non-binary people, ever more important. The complexity argues against fast-track procedures and list of safe countries. And it highlights how closely interwoven our work on asylum is with the work we as organizations are also doing on strengthening non-discrimination, combating hate, working on legal gender recognition laws that reflect self-determination, and against discrimination and the violations of the human rights of intersex people, how we're working against socioeconomic inequality. It reminds us very clearly that refugee routes are very rarely one-directional. In moving forward, we need to widen our perception on the notion of LGBTI refugees to advocate for solutions that fit this complex picture. As I said before, I was asked to talk a little bit about the work ILGA Europe is doing regarding the common European asylum system, and I want to come to this now. As most of you know, the European Commission started to look at its common rules on asylum already during the mandate of the last European Commission. At the time, the institutions, so the Council, the Parliament, and the European Commission came to interinstitutional agreements on a number of legislative files. But in the end, final agreements and decisions were taken hostage on not being able to agree on the big question of how to fairly distribute asylum seekers across the EU, the so-called reform of the Dublin system, and the introduction of quotas. The new Commission has now announced a new pact on migration and asylum. The reform of the common European asylum system is an opportunity to strengthen the rights of LGBTI people seeking asylum in the EU, and it's therefore clearly one of the focus of ILGA Europe's work on asylum. To help clarify some of the key issues around the common European asylum system, we published a briefing on LGBTI refugees and asylum seekers, as well as a detailed explanation on protecting the rights of LGBTI asylum seekers in the reform of the CES. We contributed general recommendations for the future pact without knowing yet what is to come, and how the EU can achieve an effective asylum system and enhance protection, reception, and procedural standards offered to people persecuted on the grounds of SOGIESC. And you can find all these documents on our websites. I can maybe share a link in the comments after my intervention. Our first message to the institutions now publishing the new proposals for the pact is very clear. Important advances on the protection of vulnerable groups, including LGBTI people, have been made in the negotiations on several pieces of legislation in the CES reform process already over the last years. They've been abandoned due to the deadlock in the Council, but any new legislation needs to reflect these protections and not step back from agreed improvements. But we also want to push further. To ensure all LGBTI people are protected, ILGA Europe calls for safeguarding sexual orientation and gender identity in the future pact, but also to move further and include gender expression and sex characteristics as protected and vulnerability grounds in any piece of legislation put forward under the pact. Neither current EU legislation nor the previously negotiated reform texts include gender expression and sex characteristics. They thus lead to the danger of excluding non-binary and intersex people from international protection. For the upcoming drafts and negotiations, ILGA Europe reiterates the position of the UNHCR expressed in their guidelines on international protection number 9, calling on governments, legal practitioners, decision makers, and the judiciary to ensure full and explicit inclusion of trans and intersex people. I'd like to take the liberty here to open a little bracket and talk for a moment more specifically about intersex refugees and asylum seekers. In the last round of negotiations between the European Commission, European Parliament, and the European Council, in many conversations we as ILGA Europe had with MEPs, Commission officials, Council officials, the response we got most often when calling for the inclusion of sex characteristics in EU asylum legislation was, but intersex asylum seekers do not exist. Show us the cases that call for the need to include sex characteristics. ILGA Europe is working very closely with OIA Europe, the intersex-led umbrella organization working for human rights of intersex people in Europe. We cooperate regarding advocacy and capacity building for intersex human rights. OIA Europe confirms that intersex refugees and asylum seekers exist, but also confirms that they are still indeed most often invisible. There have been cases of granting refugee status on the basis of being intersex or having variation of sex characteristics in Austria in recent years, as well as in Canada. But no one has come forward as intersex is the most used argument against introducing the ground of sex characteristics and the specific needs to intersex refugees into asylum legislation. As I said earlier, so far only 3 countries in the EU include sex characteristics as protected grounds in their laws. Adult intersex refugees will very likely not disclose being intersex due to fear of stigma. Many might not even know that the word intersex or variation of sex characteristics applies to them. And if being intersex does not classify you as protected group, if sex characteristics are not a protected ground in legislation, why come forward as being intersex? Why expose yourself to the added vulnerability? When outing themselves as intersex, the risk of being confronted with an uneducated and LGBTI intersex phobic interviewer and or interpreter is extremely high. So most intersex refugees stay invisible. But intersex refugees and asylum seekers are highly vulnerable in refugee centers, as in any housing situation with non-intersex people, due to the risk of harassment and violence for having a non-conforming body. Intersex refugees and asylum seekers are highly vulnerable in all procedures that include medical examination because of the risk of re-traumatization and often being confronted with uneducated medical personnel. They may need specific medication, including hormone substitution. Getting that medication can be challenging as it requires to out themselves as intersex, often means being confronted with uneducated medical personnel and facing coverage restrictions. They have usually no access to targeted mental health support for lack of existence of it for intersex people in general. Intersex refugees exist, they are invisible, and they are very vulnerable. I bring this up here because we want to continue to work with OIA Europe, but also with all of you to increase awareness about the existence and reality of intersex refugees and the specific challenges that they face in the procedures and among all professionals who work with asylum seekers and refugees. So my little bracket on intersex refugees is closed, and I'm getting back to the common European asylum system. So apart from including SOGS explicit as ground for protection, what are our main claims for the reform of the CES? LGBT asylum seekers are expected to identify their SOGS status during their initial interviews, such as all asylum seekers need to be extremely precise about the argumentation of their specific case at the very first occasion. If they fail to reveal their SOGS immediately and instead disclose that they are gay, lesbian, bi, trans, or intersex only at a later stage, they risk having their credibility of their claim questioned. This regards the fact that particularly upon arrival, but also already during earlier steps along the route, asylum seekers may be traumatized, distrustful, or of authorities, or feel otherwise unsafe or uncomfortable to be open about themselves. The problem of late disclosure has been closely studied also by many of you, and there are many examples. To name only one, in 2016, a trans woman from Lebanon was denied asylum in Germany because she had presented as a man when crossing from Turkey to Greece and was thus found not to be credible. How can a person be reasonably expected to disclose their LGBTI identity early in the asylum process when they are from countries where it is impossible to safely be open about who one is, especially to authorities? How can a person be expected to have outed themselves to family or to others along the asylum route when those may well be the very people they're seeking to escape? The reform of the CES needs to include clear guidance on late disclosure, reflecting case law from the Court of Justice of the European Union and UNHCR recommendations on the topic. Late disclosure might be caused by shame, not being able to name their sexual orientation, gender identity expression, or variations of sex characteristics, or by sometimes conscious decisions to not disclose their SOGS out of fear. In other cases, LGBTI refugees might not be aware that their sexual orientation, gender identity expression, or sex characteristics may be relevant to their asylum application and thus see no reason to disclose. While information on protected grounds is provided in some countries, it's not a standard applied across all EU member states. Some applicants are lucky and manage to get in touch and seek advice, most often from LGBTI organizations. Others remain without support and without crucial information for their claims. EU legislation needs to include the clear obligation of member states to explicitly include information that persecution on grounds of SOGS constitutes legitimate grounds to claim international protection. And it needs to include the obligation to train everyone involved in assessing claims, interviews, and interpreters, case officers, as well as service providers to be trained about SOGS and special needs of LGBTI people. Another important point also widely discussed and known by all of you is credibility assessments and the burden of proof that lies solely with the applicant. States are entitled to investigate the validity of any asylum claim, but the ways in which asylum seekers asserting LGBTI identities find their credibility questioned are often grounded in harmful stereotypes based on Western tropes. Again, you all know what I'm talking about. Examples such as an Iranian man having his asylum application in Austria rejected in 2018 on the grounds that he was faking being gay because his behavior was too girly, while an Afghan man was refused because neither your walk nor your behavior nor clothing indicate in any way that you might be homosexual. Credibility assessments still too frequently rely on stereotypes, prejudice, and inappropriate interference with the dignity and right to privacy. Other examples have included credibility being called into question because the asylum seeker did also identify as Muslim, And people have been refused because it was deemed not credible that they could be lesbian because they had previously been married to a man. How can people from a vast array of sociocultural, religious, linguistic backgrounds be expected to articulate their queerness with the terminology and conceptualization of the West? These examples are all symptomatic of outright stereotyping and prejudice and a lack of understanding, willful or otherwise, of the realities of being LGBTI in places where it's socially unaccepted or even illegal. The failure to recognize the diversities and realities of LGBTI lives is very clear here. And they're also a clear consequence of the dominance of one mainstream narrative about queerness, a Western narrative, a white narrative, a mainly atheist narrative, experienced and performed in Western society and context. In addition, EU asylum legislation needs to shift the burden of proof, which now solely lies with the applicant, to at least a shared burden between applicant and authorities. Evidence related to SOGS persecution are often extremely difficult to document and prove, especially in discriminatory, oppressive, criminalizing environments in the country of origin. I know some here today, some people we're also working very closely with, advocate for self-identification, shifting the burden of proof fully. And this echoes very strongly with me actually, as the question of self-determination and self-identification is such a strong thread for LGBTI activists and LGBTI advocacy on rights throughout our work. So there's a lot more to say about inadequate country information and the harmful impact of a list of safe countries that do not take the situation of gay, lesbians, bi, trans, and intersex people into account. These lists automatically lead to fast-track procedures that leave no place for individual assessments, for late disclosure, or in many cases, even for appeals. ILGA Europe stands clearly with a large number of organizations working on the rights of refugees and asylum seekers in rejecting such lists of safe countries and fast-track procedures. As I tried to set out in the first part of what I've been saying, the situation of why people flee and where the journey takes them is too complex for any such mechanisms. And all these short tracks, in most cases, lead straight into the right to asylum, the right to protection being violated. There's also a lot more to say about improvements that are urgently needed to make sure LGBTI asylum seekers and refugees are not suffering further discrimination, harm, and violence during the asylum procedure. We need to set standards to improve the reception and housing of vulnerable groups, including LGBTI people. European asylum legislation needs to ensure that violence against LGBTI asylum seekers and all forms of gender-based violence are adequately addressed in reception centers and detention. The list of characteristics taken into account during assessment of special protection needs in the Victims' Rights Directive of the European Union is the most inclusive one that should also be applied in the reform of the CES. The special needs of LGBTI people, and specifically trans and intersex people, when it comes to reception, including access to vital ongoing medical care, needs to be guaranteed. And it's important to finally also say a word about the lack of data. The current EU asylum framework and legislation includes no provision for domestic authorities to record asylum claims based on SOGS, which makes it impossible to produce reliable statistics and analysis, including regarding recognition or rejection of claims, legal assistance, processing times, reception. In the current reform, it is important that the EC encourages member states to collect and publish data on SOGS and to ensure that EASO supports member states in setting up data collection regarding the claims of LGBTI people, similar to the recommendations issued by the Fundamental Rights Agency on equality data collection. The European Commission is expected to publish the proposal for the new Migration and Asylum Pact very soon. Actually, the latest information from my colleague that just texted me before I started to speak here is that it's expected to come in September. In a position paper signed by 63 refugee and asylum support organizations, the upcoming pact was called an opportunity to improve asylum systems in Europe, to greatly expand safe and legal channels, and to mobilize EU support for inclusion. This means focusing on what is happening inside Europe, not on continuing efforts to externalize responsibilities with deals that undermine the rule of law and human rights, the values on which the EU was funded. So you can already hear in this quote that expectations are very high. But I would add that fears are also very high. The fears that what will be put on the table will be watered down. It will be a watered down proposal considering the deadlock the first attempt by the last Commission ran into. And I think these fears are equally high as the hopes. Case law in the EU, but also the important work of projects like SOGICA, of all of you, and this conference show very clearly what needs to be done to improve the protection of LGBTI asylum seekers across the region, but also within the common European asylum system. And we also all agree that the best rules are only worthy when properly implemented. Some argue that to improve, the CES needs first and foremost actually to be properly implemented. Flawed decision-making undermines the fundamental rights of those seeking protection. And one measure to tackle this problem is through supporting compliance with the provisions set out in the Common European Asylum System. The European Commission and EASO can ensure that member states allocate adequate resources to decision-making, training legal professionals, and ensuring judicial independence. For the moment, ILGA Europe published general recommendations to the process of developing the new pact. As soon as the proposal will be published, we will sit down to analyze, unite with member organizations working on asylum across the region to analyze the proposals and work then with the European Parliament, the European Council towards improving the text to ensure full protection of the fundamental rights of LGBTI asylum seekers in the EU. We're looking forward to work with all of you on this together. And we will work with our members to also bring together refugee-led initiatives and groups and facilitate together with them an assessment of the proposed legislation and to come forward specific proposals from their perspective for the improvement of legal protection and the approaches of the European Union. For the moment, the asylum lottery persists and poses a real threat to those seeking safety in the EU. It's extremely unlikely to win the lottery. Still too many are losing. Thank you very much.
Wow, Katrin, thank you so much for this incredible keynote. I think you've really set the floor for our conference, highlighting the main issues that we are facing. And I was just thinking while you were talking, I mean, our monographs, which I'm not sure whether Nuno mentioned, will actually be published in 2 volumes because it's so big. So we've written 600 pages, and still, while you were talking, I thought, well, actually, there are also some limits in our study. So to extend the SOCI to SOCI-esque, yeah, so to include also gender expression and sex characteristics, that point that you made very strong. And I think our advisory member, Vitit, who's going to give the next keynote tomorrow morning, I think he's also very keen on that, and he will be speaking about that as well. And with that, we in our project, we also try to look from an intersectional perspective. So looking at, it is about sexual orientation and gender identity, but it's also about more, and you made that point also very strong, to look at the individual cases, what other factors might be there, as you said, gender expression, sex characteristics, but maybe also religion or other factors that are important to consider when looking at the person's experience. And what I also really loved was when you were talking at the beginning about all the networks of journeys, or I think you called it the interconnected network of routes, which also brings a different perspective in, because we're always thinking of everyone just wants to come to Europe or to claim asylum in one of the EU member states, but it's much more complex than that, and the journeys are much more complex, and people are going to different places and not necessarily coming to the EU. And also, as you also addressed, also within the EU, there's still a lot to do, and there's still a lack of rights and missing rights. So yeah, a very fascinating keynote. Thank you so much. And we actually have almost 30 minutes for questions and answers. And so far we only have a couple of questions. So I would really like to encourage attendees who are listening through the Zoom form to send us some questions. So I'm going to ask you the first one. This question is coming from the UK, and I know that in the UK there is this big NGO called the UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group, and they're doing a lot of policy work and also training decision makers and so on. And there's a question: what would you recommend doing when, despite good policies and receiving training, in practice, asylum decision makers still wrongfully refuse asylum claims from LGBTQI+ people?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, thanks first, Nina, for the warm words. I have to say, I did feel very challenged in preparing this, knowing there's so many experts on this call, and also knowing that, of course, many of the things I touched upon are very well researched and very well known by all of you. I still felt that there's a point in making them, and that I should bring them up. And well, thanks, Leila, for the question. I wish I had an answer, and I think it's one of the things we only can find answers to in discussing together. And I think from the different angles, from the legal angle, so what are routes to actually challenge situations where appeals are possible, but also from the political angle, in really looking at what are the conditions that actually bring about these wrongful decisions, and also then from a support angle, and that's what I've been mentioning with LGBTI organizations. I think the reality is that as I said, as a European network, we work on set European international standard setting. We support members, but of course we're faced on asylum policies as much as on any other area of LGBTI rights, with those rights being violated, often despite legislation being in place on a day-to-day basis. And I don't think anyone has found the one magic formula. But I do think that kind of raising different voices in this process, and I think especially the kind of changing the narratives for making people understand the reality much better, trying to move away from the stereotypes, from the prejudice, and trying, and again, I think that's the big question nobody has found an answer to, trying to move away from the growing culture of suspicion, which by now is actually nearly the starting point, I feel, for assessing any asylum claims, is like disbelief, is suspicion that someone is trying to get something they're not entitled to. And I think Nuno was saying it very nicely in the film, I think. It's a right. Let's move back to the right. Let's move back to the principle of wanting to provide safety. But I do know that's not the answer you're looking for of what specifically to do. I think it would need for like much longer conversation, and I hope you'll have space for these conversations over the next few days.
Mm-hmm. And I think the tricky thing is what we also found in our research, and I've also seen this. I mean, I was volunteering for a group in Manchester for many years, called the Lesbian Migration Support Group. And we had many cases as well where you could see it is a lottery and it's an individual decision maker at the end of the day who's making a decision. And it's really shocking. I mean, I've also seen this in the fieldwork here in Germany. There are similar experiences from people, and then one person goes to the interview and they're accepted as a refugee, and the other person goes to the interview and they're not. And they're, because they're either disbelieved or there's the argument being made, well, you can still go back in your country of origin because it's not as bad as, yeah, you can just move somewhere else, yeah. While actually with the other person, it was accepted that actually the situation is too bad and they can't go back. So there's this inconsistency in decision making, yeah, while normally it's like one person making that decision. In Italy it's different. There's a panel of people making the decision, which probably is a bit fairer than just one person doing. But also what you said, I think I really liked what you said before about that there's also this culture of that now it's about protecting borders instead of protecting lives. And I think that's really the crucial point, isn't it? And what you also just said, that it's a right to claim asylum. And there's something missing there, that there is a very hostile environment, yeah, where people don't see that anymore, that actually it's a right, yeah, when you're fleeing to go to another country and claim asylum in that country. Yeah. So interesting question, yeah, but also, as you said, raising awareness, yeah, and yeah, I was also thinking about what you said before in terms of sex characteristics and gender expression, that, you know, even just starting there is still not much known. Yeah, as you said, the people are invisible, they don't have the rights, so they don't come forward because they don't feel protected. So where we perhaps all can do more to raise more awareness, so that, yeah, the situation hopefully will change in the future. Okay, so we have some more questions. One is relating to surplus reasons, asking, can you comment on the future of surplus reasons with the proposed qualification regulation, and what should we do if the regulation is adopted? So very specific legal question.
I can try to answer at this point, but as I said, it's very hard because really we're waiting for the new proposals, and we had this reflection in the office, because obviously we commented very detailed on the previous text. We were following the negotiations, and so now looking ahead at the new pact, it was a bit like what we're doing, and we really opted for these more general recommendations, as you'll see on our website, making the general points and really waiting to see what the Commission is coming forward with. So I think it's very hard to say what the future of surplus reasons will be at the proposed qualification regulation, because right now we don't know what the regulation will look like. I think, you know, us, all of us, advocacy organizations supporting LGBTI asylum seekers on the ground, but also researchers, can do a very important job right now in conversations with EU institutions. I think especially also with members of the European Parliament, if you have any access, in actually explaining the travels, explaining the journey, and explaining why ruling out surplus reasons is such a dangerous approach to take, and will actually not do justice to the claims. If really, you know, if legislation is adopted that is harmful, there is a way to go via litigation, which is very long and tiresome, which, as I said, we're doing. We on a regular basis put forward third-party interventions on litigation cases, both in Luxembourg and in Strasbourg, but also we're supporting more and more actually member organizations who are looking into litigation as one way of improving legislation. I think it's another kind of, on the one hand, encouraging, because we see how members have really picked it up and have learned to deal with litigation as an important tool. On the other hand, worrying development, because it shows how so often legislative advances on LGBTI rights in Europe have been pushed forward at the moment through strategic litigation. And who knows, that might be, unfortunately, another area where it's necessary. But I think, you know, let's not assume the worst for now. I think there's still a way to go. Even when the Commission presents their proposals now, there's actually a long way to go into the negotiation. So there'll be many opportunities for all of us to actually raise the problems and kind of try to find solutions that would allow.
Okay, that actually leads very nicely to the next question, how the international cooperation can help to come to a pact respecting the existing complexity.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that myself in you know, talking that I drew this picture and then I came back to the CES on kind of more traditional calls on the asylum system, for example. But I think really the one crucial aspect in there is country of origin information. And it was very striking. I think it was 2-3 years ago, we had a meeting with the EASO, so the European Organization Support Office on migration and asylum in Malta. And what they reported on country information that they get from like how member states are dealing with country of origin information was so clearly incomplete, especially looking at the situation of trans people, looking at the situation of intersex people for sure, but also looking at the intersectionalities that you mentioned, Nina. And I think really if we work together on that, we will catch a lot more of the complexities we're talking about. I think another thing, if we're talking about international cooperation, that will be increasingly important is humanitarian visa. We've seen this very clearly in trying to respond to the situation in Chechnya, but also in Azerbaijan, of kind of convincing European countries to first and foremost provide visa for people to get into safety. But also then seeing that that's only the first step, because that doesn't mean that you're actually allowed to stay there. That's when you then enter into the asylum claim system and you enter a whole new journey. But I think these are conversations we need to link up increasingly. I think we need to link up the conversations around intersectionality, but also the conversations about protection of human rights defenders, humanitarian visa, and all of that, kind of bringing that into the conversations we have on refugee and asylum rights will already ensure much more sophisticated answers that we can put forward to policymakers.
Yeah. Okay, I have another look. Okay. Does the role of protecting borders have to be separated from asylum determination to start protecting using out of?
Now the question is gone. No, it's still here. No, I'm not quite sure I understand that question completely. I think maybe just to say, as ILGA Europe, we work specifically on LGBTI asylum seekers and refugees, but we do work in alliance with more, you know, overall mainstream, what we call mainstream asylum and refugee organizations. And we do very clearly join calls, you know, that kind of look at the European asylum system more broadly, look at the problems that have been created through the Turkey deal, look at the very worrying support that we saw from the European Commission when it was about Greece protecting their borders and kind of pushing people back. We've also joined calls now under the COVID-19 pandemic to really point out the extremely vulnerable situation refugees and asylum seekers were in reception centers. So these are all points that, you know, for us are human rights issues that hit LGBTI people often hardest because they are often the most vulnerable, but also hit every asylum seeker and refugee arriving in Europe at the moment, and we really work very closely together on these things. But I'm not quite sure that's answering the question.
Okay. There's a question regarding heteronormativity. So this person asking the question is citing a work paper called Methodological Heteronormativity in the Refugee Crisis. So how much do you feel heteronormativity plays a role in decision making, and do you feel it is different than outright disbelief and or discrimination on social issues? Very interesting question. Yeah. So how does heteronormativity, so if you think that's relating to just what you said before, that obviously, I mean, that's why we're doing this work, to show that there are specific needs and specific issues. So how does heteronormativity creep in and decision making, specifically when we look at LGBTQI claims?
Yeah, I think I tried to touch upon that when I talked about the credibility assessment. And I think it's very hard to judge if people want to dismiss or if people believe they're judging to their best knowledge and they just can't be convinced. I think it would be unfair to make a general judgment, and I can't do that. But I am convinced that, of course, and I said that heteronormativity is linked to stereotypes, is linked to perceptions, is linked to how we see, how some people see the world compared to others, how some people have a certain scheme of looking at the world, and things that don't fit in there cannot be true. And that's why I think that's what I meant before with kind of challenging that Western concept of queerness as well. That is so important. We cannot expect that a gay person from Vietnam expresses their queerness in the same way that a gay person living in Belgium would, let alone if they've been fleeing persecution in their own country, just to name a random example. And so I think it's all these patterns and these one way of expecting how people are supposed to be, that's of course very, very closely linked to heteronormativity. And so any attempts of breaking that up will actually help to come much, much closer to a real case assessment and an individual assessment free of prejudice for many cases. I think we see it very, very clearly as well if we look really at religion and belief and kind of the intersection there, and how that is very often used to kind of distort claims of LGBTI asylum seekers and discredit them.
Yeah, and here again, as we said before, a more kind of intersectional perspective perhaps help you to bring other factors in that you just mentioned. Okay, so we have a very interesting comment here from Austria.
Yeah.
Regarding the lottery. Yeah. So in Austria, so the person, oh, it's just gone again. Wait a minute.
There's a similar question from the UK, actually.
No, here it is again. So I think it just moves down so quickly when somebody else asks a question. Yeah. So in Austria, we can observe that it makes a huge difference whether LGBTI asylum seekers manage to get in touch with peer organizations. For example, Queer Base, they're doing really great work in Austria. In terms of coming out in the state of residence, being prepared for the interview in terms of mental health or safe accommodation, what do you think about that? What do you recommend also in relation to individual and rights member states obligations? So yeah, this is about receiving support from organizations and the importance of that.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I can only echo what both the examples from the UK and Austria are saying. I think I tried to mention that before. It's very, very clear that if LGBTI asylum seekers manage to reach out to support organizations, they're in many ways much better prepared, but also much better supported. Also when it comes to shelters, to receptions and all of that. I think the support that peer communities giving in that process is actually invaluable. But also, and that's the shocking thing when it comes to information about the claims, information on how to prepare yourself for the first interview. Very often LGBTI organizations are actually able to put people in touch with pro bono legal support. And without that, claims from the beginning are actually bound to fail. What does that mean for international human rights and protection? It means that the system fails at the moment, and it means that NGOs are trying to fill a gap, as actually in many, many cases. I was mentioning the example of Armenia, where the social service providers reach out to the LGBTI organization and say, you need to help us because we don't know anything about the needs of LGBTI asylum seekers. They've now arrived from Syria, what we're gonna do. And NGOs are filling that gap with extremely low resources, very often on a volunteer basis. And I think we also need to look much, much closer into that. So how is the LGBTI community, how are LGBTI organizations actually resourced to fill that gap? So if that gap clearly still exists, if that gap for the time being needs to be filled because social service providers, the state authorities, asylum authorities cannot fill that gap, how are we resourcing then the organizations that are stepping up to help people through the process? I think that's one of the key question that comes to mind in that. But yes, I can only agree about the importance of that work for claimants, actually.
I mean, that is definitely also one of the outcomes of the Sochika project. But what we've also seen in Germany, especially, is that people are often accommodated in such rural areas where they can't actually access any community support. So that's been a really big issue to also campaign for what kind of accommodation is provided and where people are put. Okay, let me have another look. I think I had a question here. Oh yeah, a very good question. This is actually from one of the Sochika participants in Germany. Hello. She's asking, how can we get the stakeholders involved, or what we're doing to get decision makers involved in these conferences, because we can speak forever, but without the attention or ear of stakeholders, nothing will change, unfortunately. So very, very good point. Thanks for asking that. Yeah, do you have any ideas? I'm not sure, because I haven't really looked at the registration list, whether there are decision makers who registered for the conference. I hope there are, but generally, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I know the feeling. We once in the organization jokingly decided we're only going to join panels where we don't know at least 3 of the other panelists. So just to echo, I think this kind of feeling of talking to each other is very strong, and I think we all need to encourage each other that we're still reaching beyond. I can just say from our work, obviously we're really clearly targeting policymakers in the conversation now. Even there, of course, it's the same game. Of course, the members of the European Parliament most likely to first invite us to an event and listen are the people who are aware, who want to talk about the issues, who want to strengthen their positions within their own groups and within the European Parliament. But I think it goes from there to widen. I also think we shouldn't underestimate the role we play in kind of educating the people, equipping people who we might feel are already on that side and want to talk about LGBTI asylum seekers, but very often don't have the terminology, don't have the examples, don't have the stories. And I think that's so important as well, because by that we strengthen allies, and they already have a further reach than we might have. And so we're all kind of going step by step at a time, I would say. One thing we're also doing is really to try specifically with other stakeholders. So, picking up these conversations with trade union movements, for example, how they can play a voice in there. So we're trying to see what are the less likely stakeholders around the table that could actually have a voice in the discussion. But I do know that it sometimes feels tiresome to actually reach beyond.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting strategy to only go to panels when you don't know.
We never applied it strictly, but
okay, we have a question here. Can you talk comparatively about how queer people from different parts of the world are broadly processed within European asylum regimes? My question stems from growing public awareness of needing to distinguish between broader people of color and Black experiences of marginalization within our societies. I'm wondering about necessity of doing so within our research going forward beyond just focusing on country case studies. So yeah, also very important questions, probably also relating to the Black Lives Matter issues that are now being discussed. Yeah, what do you think of
and
that?
to be very, very honest, I would be very interested in knowing more about that myself. So my assumption is that, yes, there will be a difference. My assumption is that it's probably broad and it's probably quite eye-opening. I think, you know, what we see in racial profiling in any kind of contacts with authorities and all of that across Europe, I am convinced it applies here as well. But I don't know of any analysis. I think it's got to do with the lack of data I also refer to, which is really a crucial hurdle of looking into all of that. But I'd be definitely interested to learn more about it and to hear. So I don't know if in the framework of the conference or in the framework of kind of, you know, the people you're working with, if there is someone looking more into that, I'd definitely be more very interested to hear more and discuss further.
I mean,
I know we don't have that information at the moment.
Yeah, I know my colleague Menja Jaleh, she has just published a paper on how Black lesbian asylum claimants in Germany, how their claims are being treated, and there is the thought that they actually face an incredible high percentage or proportion of refusals. So, and that goes back again what we said before, you know, we have to think about an intersectional perspective, maybe also how a culture of disbelief, how different factors creep in, yeah, when we look at the culture of disbelief. So it's 11:30 already. Unfortunately, there are a couple of more questions that we couldn't address now. I don't know whether you want to have a very quick look if you see the questions, if there's any you want to pick out as a last question, anything that we can maybe.
I mean, maybe just on the, I see there's one question from Queerbase on the vulnerable groups. I think that's one area where actually the EU is advancing quite well. So both in definitions, I mean, again, in the previous document, so we don't know where it's going. It looked quite promising, and also the European Asylum Support Office is working on like tools to support vulnerable groups, and is actually quite strong in including LGBTI people in that. We are part of kind of an advisory group of organizations to the development of these tools. And so I do think there, I think I'm a bit more positive than on many of the other questions that were raised. So it's nice to finish with that maybe.
Okay. So thank you, Katrin. It's a shame that we are not in a big audio where we can all clap. So I'm clapping for the whole audience and say thank you. It was incredible. I love the discussions as well right now with you. Yeah, let's keep in touch, definitely.
Yeah.
And going to follow you, the incredible work you're doing. Yeah, and for everyone who's been listening, so there will be a break for 30 minutes and then the next sessions start, or if you're just listening to the keynotes, tomorrow morning will be the next one at 9:30 UK time. So thank you very much. Thanks again, Katrin. Thanks everyone for listening, and we hope to see you sometime later during the day, everyone.
Yeah. And thank you, Nina, and thanks everyone from Sojika for inviting me. And good luck with the conference, and I'll tune in as well to hear more. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.